Welcome back to another in the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan universe discussions, where I'm rereading the entire Tom Clancy Jack Ryan verse in story chronological order, trying to figure out whether or not he had help from anybody inside the government, giving him tips, giving him tricks, and maybe even if some of the new authors were getting tips or tricks as we go along. Made it up to Debt of Honor. This one is 800-pound gorilla. That is book 9 in the Jack Ryan universe. And if you're counting along, that's 5,434 pages so far that I've read of these books, looking for hints on was he a government asset? Now, this book is set in 1995 and 96, sort of a few years after the Sum of All Fears and right before executive orders. And it's an interesting book. Now, when it first came out, I, like a lot of people, I was in my 20s. Jack Ryan fan, but there's a whole lot of sort of stuff up front in this one, and we'll get to that in a second. That I was like, come on, get to the part with airplanes and spies and espionage, and the part that we all like. But Tom Clancy does this great job of setting up a conflict. He does it with a lot of detail, and sometimes I can criticize that detail along with everybody else, but this this particular one, as I look back on it, he sort of saw a lot of things coming that we don't necessarily like. And some of it was 9/11 related. We'll get to that. So let's just dive right in. So Jack Ryan, after Some of All Fears, left government employment, went back to being a stockbroker, went off and made a bunch of money. And he's trying to take up golf. He doesn't like it very much because it's not all that much fun. Then he gets a call and is tapped to be the national security advisor after one of them quits. Because people at that level, they tend to be a lot older. They sometimes stressful job. They come in and out as they see as things progress. But this time, there's an issue going on that Jack will have to dive into. That sort of originates in Japan. That's unique for his background. Because remember, Jack, he's part stockbroker, he's part intel agent. He's kind of done both for a living. And this one also kind of gets into the world of cybersecurity, and in particular, cybersecurity when it comes to banking and investments, and shows just how fragile that part of the world is. I don't want to say those systems are unsecure, but it does show what happens if you manage to get in there and start jacking with it. And we'll get to what that means in a minute, because they jacked with it in a big kind of way and almost took the stock market, the whole U.S. economy down with it, which the way they did it kind of would sort of work that way. One of the subplots in this, Clancy always has like 15 of them, but there's one that actually matters. There's a former senator, now a vice president, who has a history of sexual improprieties. Let's just say assault, that's been covered up repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, and because that would just never happen in Washington, right? Hard to imagine that happening inside DC. There's actually a fund in Congress that annually just goes off and settles those things. It's like, oh, here, have some money and please sign this NDA. Right? And it happens all the time. Google that one if you don't believe me. There actually is a congressional fund to pay people off to not sue. So it's not a big leap in DC to have that kind of a scandal. Clancy makes a repetitive point that at this point in history, the U.S. military was generally considered to have been so successful at its job that it really wasn't needed anymore. And a bunch of soldiers were basically kind of bored, going, what's the point? We can defeat if every military in the world came at us at once, we could win, right? And they were kind of that point. And remember, it was mid 90s. This was after Soviet Union fell apart. People weren't spending any money on military. Nobody else had built up. 9/11 hadn't happened yet. And he was kind of right. I was in the military at that point. Did kind of feel that way. Everything was getting smaller, and because there just wasn't a need for it. And surprise, surprise, there turned out to be a need for it again later. Clancy does go into detail about and another thing that does come into our news cycle every day lately, it seems like. He goes into a lot of detail about the power of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and what they can do to the general economy just by kind of flipping a few switches. Now, think about this for a minute. There are a very small group of people that are not elected by anybody. We don't get a vote on who it is, right? We don't get to go out and say, I cast a ballot for this person or that person. No. These are people who are just appointed, and they have an enormous amount of power about what goes on in our economy, about interest rates, about what's going to happen with the market, what's going to happen with bond rates, and if bond rates go up too high, well, guess what? The mortgages and car loans and everything we pay for go up. So these guys have a lot of power, and not a lot of people really understand exactly how they work. And Clancy goes into great detail about it because that's kind of what he's known for. And I thought that was interesting given the world we have today, where we have almost politicized. In fact, we have politicized the board of the Federal Reserve Board and said, look, let's do things for this president, not for that president. And really, who cares about the guy in the Oval Office, in my opinion? I don't. What I care about is the health of the economy and not picking winners and losers. And what the Federal Reserve Board can do, I'm not saying they have, but maybe they have on occasion, they can decide whether or not the stock market matters, or whether or not interest rates matter, whether or not inflation matters. But as long as the stock market looks good, everything's fine. Who cares about those inflation numbers? That doesn't matter that much. Only affects everybody. But the stock market's up, and that's good, right? So those are interesting things to think about, just how much power those guys have. And Clancy describes it in detail. He goes into a lengthy, also, and I think interesting sort of rant about just how fictional modern money is. And before anybody comes at me and goes, oh, crypto's not any better. Okay. It's all digital streams of crap. It's all numbers in a computer someplace, and there's nothing really backing it up. It's not backed by anything other than the US dollar is backed by kind of the strength of the US economy and the promise of the federal government to make sure it's still worth something. And that's really backed up by our military, to be honest. Because if the uh, international trades always done in US dollars were sort of the reserve currency, especially for oil. Um, and if that ever changes, value of the US dollar goes through, is not good. So it's really our military, honestly, that kind of keeps it where it is. But in a conflict, at this time, in this book, kind of originates from Japan. And you're kind of like, Japan? Why would it originate there? Well, there's some historical reasons why it might. Now, many people in charge of various things in Japan were at this point, still kind of reeling from what happened in World War II. They either were kids, or they knew people, or their parents were involved in World War II, and the USA was seen as sort of dominant and in ways very arrogant. Even though all of our manufacturing was leaving and going overseas, and Asia was growing economically, but they still looked at us as sort of the arrogant kids on the block, like, oh, they think they know everything, and we still probably have that reputation around the world. But Clancy kind of goes into just a lot of detail in describing what that looks like to Asian countries, and he goes on an interesting long economic almost tirade about how book value for everything from real estate to stocks to is a huge weak point for us. Like, we've kind of made up, oh, my house is worth X dollars. Well, who says, right? It's only worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And we found out in 2008 that if you overinflate that market, you can kind of pretty much crash the US economy if you're not careful. And if you look at what's going on in the world today, we may not be far from that, because the housing prices have gone up so quickly over the last 4 or 5 years. And not a day goes by you don't see a news article about commercial real estate falling apart, which is part of that same process. So what happens if someone does pump the stock market value way up, and then is it allowed to realistically deflate, or do we just pump it up and let it have these natural cycles, or do we pump it up and then along comes somebody and plays a little trick and goes pooh and destroys it for you after they pumped it up and cashed out? So now the book does suffer from one thing, and I want to say this: Clancy does overdo some technical details. It does have basically every imaginable subplot in it, including look how good of a husband Jack Ryan is, which he said over the years that Tom Clancy said over the years that it was modeled after himself. I think he was trying to convince us all he was a great guy. Even though I never met him, I've heard things, but he was certainly trying to make us all believe something about himself. And he's such a great writer, though, that even with all the subplots, he kind of pulls it up, and we don't really care, even though it is so long. But it could have been shorter in ways. But with the economic stuff in this one, I'm not sure too many people really understand how all that stuff works. And he goes into a lot of detail. I had to call people that worked in the field to see if he was right. Sure enough, he is. So the book becomes this trade war with Japan. Something else that's happening in our daily news is not with Japan, it's with China, but it's basically we're in a trade war with basically the whole planet right now. And what are the what are the potential downsides to that? And Clancy does get into that, which is kind of interesting in a way. Um, so it he does get into the sort of delicate economic balance of global power, and it does make you think about what keeps the peace. Is it economics? Is it economics that really drives peace? Everything's going fine economically, so we have world peace ish. What happens if people are economically kind of screwed, right? Does that lead to a shooting war? And in this case, it did. The trade war quickly led to a shooting war as Japan tried to increase its territory and therefore natural resources, because Japan doesn't really have that many natural resources, and they wanted them. Clancy does shows a way to actually trigger and inside our stock market system a way to kind of screw things up that may or may not be able to be recovered. So what if a trading system like a Bloomberg wasn't reflecting reality? So let's say I'm sitting here trading stocks, and what I'm seeing on my screen is not what's reflected in reality. And the main trading houses, and these days it's all done in dark pools anyway, but the dark pools aren't keeping track of that. How do you know what bank has how much money? What account has how much money if those records aren't very carefully kept and settled at the end of every set period of time? And if you lost a whole day, what really happens, right? So if you lost like a half a day of trading and billions of dollars traded hands, but you don't know where it all went, how do you sort that mess out, right? And does that affect things like ATMs? Do banks understand just how much cash they have? Do they understand how much cash you have? Can you go to your bank and reliably get cash out? That's a big problem, because if you think about it, nobody keeps enough cash to get through more than about even in 95, nobody kept enough cash to get more than through a day or two. And now it's like people don't carry cash at all anymore. Debit cards stop working. People aren't going to be able to eat, right? Because God forbid we go a day without Grubhub. I do, because I have teenage boys and they eat a lot, but that's beside the point. Now, as Japan gears up for a war that's really based on economics, they turn it into an actual war, and it really is something, if you look back historically, that has happened. For instance, World War II, which I think World War II is one of the most overused comparisons of anything ever. But World War II was really sort of the closing act of World War One, and it was set up really because of the way World War One ended. Germany's economy was just shot to hell, and hyperinflation was taking place, and it was an economic war, among many other things, but economics played a role. Because I think without the economic challenges, Hitler wouldn't have been able to come to power as easily as he did. He may still have, but hindsight's always 2020. So there has been, if you think back to our world also, so there's been this trade war in the book, and there's a trade war going on in our daily lives right now. And there's been a desire of some nations to get the US dollar to quit being the reserve currency of the world. Somebody else wants that, right? Because it's good for you. The only problem with that is it's been sort of decades since the U.S. has had that capacity. It's always been in our treasury bonds. We have a big pile of debt here in the United States, and a lot of it is owned by other countries. So people want us to continue to succeed so they can get paid back. Well, what happens if that's not possible, right? Okay, we just go to the Federal Reserve. Back to that one again, and they just print a bunch of money and we pay it back. Well, that's going to piss people off, because now there's way more dollars, and the dollar's not worth as much because we purposely inflate it, but that's also going to hurt you and me. So you've got these big problems when you get into these trade wars, that if you don't get it just exactly right, you can just kind of bring in disaster. And Clancy points that out in a lot of ways, that a trade war is a dangerous thing to go off and do. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, we go through other books of his. We go through Clear and Present Danger, Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games Without Remorse. Yeah, he's nailed a lot of stuff and made us all kind of go, dude's right, man. He kind of nailed a whole bunch of them. And then you get to this one, you're like, trade war can be really dangerous, and he explains why. And I'm like, holy shit, he's actually right. So let's say somebody goes off and starts dumping U.S. bonds. Well, in order to make it interesting for people to buy them, we have to increase that interest rate. Well, how high does that interest rate go? You've got, whatever it boils out to be, it's going to affect mortgages. It's going to affect car loans. And if you impact those mortgages the way that would, along with the overinflated value of homes that have gone up over the last 4 or 5 years, high interest rate, high prices, you've got this problem, right? Nobody can afford to do much of anything. So a dumping of those bonds could effectively not only cause a run of the US dollar, but crash our stock market at the same time, because those two things are kind of, interlinked in various ways. And he explains all that. So you kind of look at it like, holy crap, he's exactly right, man. We get into a trade war, it's almost, I won't say it's more dangerous than a shooting war, but whew, there's not good things that come out of those if you're not the winner. So as I read this book, I'm like, dude was right. So he comes up with a solution for the hack that took place in the stock exchange, which originated in Japan, that I don't think anybody would ever go for. But in the book, he kind of says, okay, here's how I would fix it. Jack does help end the war. Of course, Jack is always everybody's hero. He fixes everything because it's the way the stories go. But the economic war really kind of played point on this. And as a result of, remember back to the beginning of the video, there was a vice president who was sort of tapped out because of a scandal. Jack was the national security advisor. He was also the sort of front man on helping solve the shooting war as well as the economic war. So Jack was the hero of the story as usual, because that's the way Jack Ryan books work. And at the end, they tap him to be the vice president. They're like, hey, Jack, you wanted to leave government service anyway. The president, who was the opposite party of Jack Ryan, was leaving office in 9 months, about to go run for re-election. They're like, hey, why don't you fill the VP slot for a year? I'll go run for office with somebody else. Then the government will leave you alone forever and ever, and you'll be able to retire peacefully, right? Well, no, not really, because as Jack Ryan is being sworn in and confirmed and voted on and all that stuff, of course, and giving us, I'm going to give a spoiler alert on a book that's 30 years old. An airplane flies into the Capitol building and wipes out the president, the large part of the cabinet, House, Senate, some Supreme Court justices, in a very 9/11 style attack. 747 right in the Capitol, takes out most of the federal government. Jack survives. And now Jack is sworn in as president, and basically the close of the book is, let's get to work. But this book really made you think. Not only did he kind of come up with the 9/11 style attack, which honestly is not a big stretch because Japanese Zeros were a thing, and it was on the terror list for a long time. And he got this. He really does make you think about the economic trade wars, and just how dangerous those are, and just how careful you got to be and how good you got to be to get that exactly right. Because the unintended consequences of one of those things could be, as we're seeing, huge swings in the stock market, huge swings in interest rate, economic uncertainty. Economic uncertainty is bad. When you have that, people stop spending money. They stop going on vacation. They want to sequester their cash. And as that becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that drives, if there's no economic certainty and nobody wants to go off and spend any money, that can drive recessions, if not depression. So, certainty matters. And in the midst of economic chaos, you don't have any certainty. So companies and individuals are going to start behaving differently than they normally would. And that can be a very dangerous thing. And Tom Clancy has an 800-page warning shot for us that says, don't mess around with trade wars, man. They're not good. It's easier to win a shooting war than it is a trade war if you're not careful. So I hope Tom Clancy is, I hope this doesn't really come to pass, but and he may have just absolutely nailed two of them here. Now, does this book give any indication that he was getting help? I think the Federal Reserve has been sort of hated for a long time. I think they've been sort of the cautionary tale for a lot of people for a long time. I think the trade war was probably predictable. I think the 9/11 style attack was probably predictable. Did anybody whisper some of this stuff to him? This one was hard to tell. This one was kind of, there's nothing really techno wise in it that's hard to figure out. And somebody sitting down and thinking about it for a while could probably come up with all this. But the way he spun it together was just, a master doing his craft. So I really enjoyed the book. I'm still enjoying going through these. That was book 9 in the Jack Ryan universe. The next one up is Executive Orders, which is another book that if you drop it on your foot, you just may as well have the foot amputated because it's a big 850-page monster. But I have a 3-day weekend with no kids, so you never know. I could get through it. But great book. If you have not read it, I think it's more in tune with what's going on in the world today than it was when it was written. And I think the 9/11 style attack at the very end may prove to be the one of the two things that Clancy got right in this one, because man, he got that trade war just dead on. So everybody, if you have not read it, please give it a look, give it a read. If you don't want to read that many pages, there is an audiobook, very good audio narration of it. So we'll see you on the next video. Talk to you soon.